example. Now, and if you notice, it says that, he says, behold, a white horse. Question is, who is this rider on this white horse?
Jesus.
Okay, a lot of people think it's Jesus, and one of the reasons they think that it's Jesus here is because in Revelation chapter 19, this is how he's depicted. He's depicted coming back on a white horse. In fact, the same Greek words for white horse, leukos, which is where we get, from our root for leukemia, leukos hippos, or white horse, are used in Revelation chapter 19. And the word is used to describe victory, peace, purity, innocence. It describes the redeemed church, and it's a color of the garment of angels. However, this is actually not Jesus. People think it's either one of two things. It either is referring to the Antichrist, which the Apostle John describes in his second epistle, or it's the beast of Revelation. If you go to Revelation chapter 13, it talks about taking the mark of the beast. People think that it's referring to this, or as the Apostle Paul describes him as the man of lawlessness. But as we're going to see, all these other riders on white horses actually depict actual forces that God unleashes on the earth, and essentially it's this rider on this white horse is ushering in a time of false peace. And the way we know this is the weapon that's actually used. You notice where he says, "And he who sat on it had a bow." Well, a bow is also a symbol of war, but if you notice something, what's something that goes along with normally goes with a bow that's not mentioned here? Arrows, right? Bow and arrows, right? And they use bow and
no arrow.
Huh?
It's got no arrows.
There's no arrow, and the reason that there's no arrow is that it indicates that when war is depicted, it's a sign of false peace, and it's going to be a time of a bloodless coup. It's because there's no arrows. It's a peace that's going to be won by covenant and by agreement. And if you notice that this rider has this crown on his head, the Greek word for crown is Stephanos. It's where we get our English name Stephen from. It means crown. And it's a type of wreath that's actually awarded to athletes. If you've ever seen, like the Greek Olympics and everything, and they have these wreaths, this is a type of crown that's placed, for people that were awarded to athletes. And these crowns in the Bible are depicted as a time of eternal blessedness. For instance, the New Testament says that those that are in the church are going to be receiving imperishable crowns for the work that they did on earth here to advance God's kingdom. And there's like 4 or 5 different types of crowns. But this crown that's placed on this false Messiah, or this rider on this white horse, he's going to be elected king of the entire world, and he's going to use his power in order to conquer the whole world in order to advance Satan's kingdom on earth. In fact, in the Old Testament, the Apostle Daniel actually talks about this particular time period. And he said, "And he," referring to the Antichrist, "will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week." In the Bible, whenever you hear the word 1 week, it symbolizes a 7-year time period. So they will make a covenant for 1 week or 7 years. But in the middle of that week, in the middle of those 7 years, he, meaning the Antichrist, will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, until even a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. So basically what Daniel is saying, this Antichrist is going to usher in a time of false peace. But then in the middle of this false peace, he's going to break this covenant, and the people he's going to break this covenant is the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel is literally going to make a covenant with the Antichrist. He's going to make.
So is this at 3.5 or?
What's that?
Why?
This is still at the very beginning of the tribulation period. But when the covenant is broken,
that's why I was wrong about who was on the white horse.
And that's okay, because you know what? A lot of people are going to get this wrong, right, because this is going to be a time of real horror.
When you think white,
yeah,
you think Jesus.
Right.
You don't think something negative.
Right. And as Mike and Lucia had brought up, and I even put it up on the board here, it's actually going to be a false peace.
False peace, there it is.
Yeah, false peace. So so good.
Right.
All right. And what's going to happen is that there's going to be this time of false peace, but then the next rider, on the next horse is going to come. So if you go down to verse 3, and it says, "When he," meaning Christ, "broke the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, 'Come.' And another, a red horse, went out, and to him who sat on it was granted to take peace from the earth, and that men would slay one another, and a great sword was given to him. The Greek word for red is the word pyros. Have you ever heard like someone that's a pyromaniac? This is what it means. And it's literally a fiery blood red color. And it actually depicts a time of worldwide war. We hear of wars all over the world, but there's some places where it's very peaceful. During this time period when the second seal is broken and the rider on the red horse comes in, there's going to be war all over the world. There's going to be a country, that's going to be safe during this time. And it's going to remove this false sense of peace that was promised to the nation of Israel. And it says that men will be slaying one another. Essentially, it's going to be commonplace. And we're beginning to see some of that even today, where a person will go in and they'll just shoot a cop in a car, or they'll go down and they'll have a problem with someone and they'll just kill them in the street. And we hear stories here and there, but during the tribulation period, this is going to be happening all over. This is going to be happening to family members. Family members are going to be killing family members. And in verse 3, is it verse 3 or verse 4, when it talks about using the sword, it's not going to be like this long sword that you think of. Rather, it's more of a small sword that's used for assassinations. The Apostle Peter, Matthew chapter 26, when they went to arrest Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he went and he struck the guard and cut off his ear with the sword, it's this type of sword, or like long curved-shaped dagger, that was being used. And this is the type of swords that are going to be used because people are just going to be assassinating people simply because they don't like them. And it's going to be a time of worldwide revolt, massacres, and wholesale slaughters. And we see this in the news today, but this is going to be nothing compared to what's going to be going on, because this is going to be going on a global scale. In fact, in the Old Testament book of Zechariah the prophet in chapter 1, he talks a little bit about this time period, and including some of this stuff going on in his time, where he sees this vision, and he says, "I saw at night, and behold, a man was riding on a red horse, and he was standing among the myrtle trees, which were in the ravine, with red, sorrel, and white horses behind him. Then I said, My Lord, what are these? And the angel who was speaking with me said to me, I will show you what these are. And the man who was standing among the myrtle trees answered and said, These are those whom the Lord has sent to patrol the earth." So a lot of people think that these riders that are coming either are going to be angels, or the angels are the ones that are going to be basically releasing, this war and calamity and everything else that's going on. And that's because angels in the Bible are instruments of God's judgment. Later on in Zechariah chapter 6, he writes, "Now I lifted up my eyes again and looked, and behold, 4 chariots were coming forth from between the 2 mountains, and the mountains were bronze mountains." Now, in biblical times, what pulled chariots? What type of animals pulled chariots? Horses. So same type of imagery John is borrowing from Zechariah here. With the first chariot were red horses, and the second chariot black horses, and the third chariot white horses, very same colors. And with the fourth chariot strong dappled horses. Then I spoke and said to the angel who was speaking with me, "What are these, my Lord?" The angel replied to me, "These are the 4 spirits of heaven going forth after standing before the Lord of all the earth, with one of which the black horses are going forth to the north country, and the white ones go forth after them, while the dappled ones go forth to the south country." When the strong ones went out, they were eager to go to patrol the earth. And he said, "Go patrol the earth." So they patrolled the earth. So he's borrowing this type of imagery, that angels are actually behind it. Plus it says that the black horses go to the north and the strong horses go to the south, which shows that God is a Buckeye fan. So let's go to the... I've been waiting to use that one.
How did you figure that out?
Okay, so...
And I thought he was all-knowing.
Which brings us to the next seal that's broken, the third seal, which releases the rider on the black horse. So let's go to verse 5. Verse 5, "When he broke the third seal, I heard the third living creature saying, Come. I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on had a pair of scales in his hand." The word here for black is literally translated black ink. In other words, it's talking about the darkest possible color of black, because there's some black that are kind of mixed in or whatever, but this is the darkest black. In the letters of 2 Peter and the Epistle of Jude, it describes hell as a black darkness. We tend to think of hell that when a person goes there, they're going to be able to see it. In reality, the Bible describes hell as blackness because it's the complete absence of light. So even a person's going to be experiencing agony and hellfire, but they're not going to see it. Then they're not going to see it because there's not going to be any light there. And it's like, how can there be fire without light? Well, this is a supernatural world. So God is going to remove this light, from hell. But this word black is used in verse 12 when it talks about the sun becomes black as sackcloth. In other words, people aren't going to be able to see the sun. It's going to be completely blacked out. And this blackness signifies famine, and it's when the food supply will be destroyed, and there's going to be global hunger on a worldwide basis. In Jeremiah chapter 5 in the Old Testament, Jeremiah laments about this when he says, we get our bread at risk of our lives because of the sword in the wilderness. Our skin has become as hot as an oven because of the burning heat of famine. And if you notice, it says that he's got a pair of scales. The word for scales is where we get our word yoke from. Have anybody ever said, don't be unequally yoked? What this comes from is when beasts of burden were like plowing in the fields, they had to make sure that the same animal, he had to have two animals with equal strength, and because they were basically connected to each other. And if one kind of fell back a little bit, it would incur an incredible burden to the farmer. They had to have the same strength, and that's where the word yoke comes from. And what it is that these scales is a metaphor for troublesome laws, bondage, burden. What's going to happen is that the government that's going to be run by the Antichrist is going to put these incredible burdens during this period of time, and there's going to be a scarcity of food, there's going to be rationing that's never been seen before, and there's going to be food lines. When we take a look at other countries and we see these long food lines because the government is not distributing it the way it should, this is going to happen on a global scale, including in the United States and other free countries around the world. And he gives an example of this, how bad it's going to be. Go down to verse 6. And I heard something like a voice in the center of the four living creatures saying, a quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not damage the oil and the wine. A quart of wheat will be equivalent of the food for 1 day's worth for one person. A denarius in biblical times was currency that was given for 1 day's worth of work. So basically you'll have to literally work 1 whole day to get 1 quarter of wheat, and that would be your food for the day if you're lucky. And then he says 3 quarts of barley. Barley is basically a low nutrient grain that's fed to animals. And again, it's for a 1 day food for one person because it will cost 1 denarius. So this is how scarce food is going to be, not just for certain countries or certain parts of the world, but everywhere. And another reason why we know we're not in the tribulation period yet, because otherwise we'd be experiencing this. And then he says, oh, and by the way, don't damage the oil and the wine. Well, oil in biblical times was used for the preparation of bread, and wine was necessary for cooking and for purifying water. In biblical times, water was filthy, it was contaminated. In order to purify it, you would have to mix wine with it so it would be drinkable. When people drank wine, it was diluted in water, so it took longer for them to get drunk if they drank it. So basically what they're saying is that oil and wine, these are going to become luxuries. So oil used to prepare bread and wine used to purify water and necessary for cooking. Make sure that you don't damage this, because if you go through it, you're done. You don't have purified water, you can't make bread. And then the last rider, which comes on the ashen or the pale horse, is in verse 7 and 8. When the Lamb, which is Jesus, broke the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature saying, come. I looked, and behold, an ashen horse, and he who sat on it had the name Death, and Hades was following with him. Authority was given to them over 1/4 of the earth. to kill with sword and with famine and with pestilence and by the wild beasts of the earth. Here it says ashen. In some translations, it's a pale rider. It comes from the Greek word chloros, where we get a word chloroform from. And it's kind of a greenish, almost yellowish, sickly, pale color. Essentially, it's the color of grass as it begins to burn and die. And it's used in Revelation chapter 8 and verse 9. And it's from the Greek word that's translated Chloe, which is a very beautiful female name, Chloe, which literally means a green herb, and it's used in 1 Corinthians 1. But like it says, it comes from this Greek word, but it also means pale and sickly. So I don't know if I'd want to name my daughter Chloe. So, because the word literally ashen or pale describes the decomposition of a corpse. If you've ever seen somebody die and their skin begins to change and it has a grayish color, this is the depiction that they're trying to show. Because when the rider on the pale or ashen horse comes, death will occur to 25% of the world. And we're only getting started. This is only the fourth seal. This is at the very beginning of the tribulation period. So a death, and it's going to occur by the sword, and this type of sword is actually a longer sword. It's like a javelin where people are going to be impaled. It's going to be a time where people die from famine, and it's going to be from pestilence. Some translations say disease, death, or even plague, as you can kind of see up on the board there. And beasts of the field. It literally means that people are going to be ripped apart by wild animals during this period of time. We saw this in the first few centuries of the church when people, like I said, were being fed to lions and other wild beasts. During the tribulation period, Christians, believers in Christ, are going to return to that. And like I said, we're just getting started. The word pestilence literally is translated death. It's used in Revelation chapter 20 when it talks about those who die experience the second death. The second death is eternal hellfire. And dictionary.com defines pestilence as a deadly or virulent epidemic disease such as the bubonic plague that killed 1/3 of Europe. Right now we are going through the coronavirus, and people are saying it's a pandemic because it's worldwide. But the type of pestilence that they're talking about 1/4 of the people aren't just going to be getting this disease, they're going to be killed by it. And we're not experiencing that right now. So it's not really a pandemic in the biblical sense. The bubonic plague was, because it killed 12 to 15 million people during that period of time. Another thing, if you take a look real quick in verse 8 when it talks about death and Hades, we've talked about this in other Bible studies. Does anybody remember the difference between death and Hades? Because he seems to separate the two.
Well, Hades isn't hell.
Hades is not hell, no.
Hades is like where he goes to
before he goes to hell. Okay, yep. But what's the difference between death and Hades? Anybody?
They don't die when they're in Hades.
Well,
they're just suffering.
They're suffering, but more specifically, death. I'm trying because he says death and Hades. So they're different, even though they're together. Death is a condition. Right now we're alive. That's our condition now. Death is a condition after you die. So that's what he means by death.
Right.
Think of the Grim Reaper. If you've ever seen the Grim Reaper with a sickle and everything, that's death. That's a condition. Hades, but like you said, is the place where an unbeliever goes to die. When Jesus was talking about the parable of the rich man, he says he died and went to Hades. And then after Hades, he was suffering during this time period. So today, anytime anybody goes to Hades, which is a temporary realm of the dead, they know they're eventually going to end up in hell. If you end up in Hades, that's not a good place. You're not going to heaven. Because in Revelation chapter 20,
it's going to get worse.
It's going to get worse. John says that death and Hades will be cast into the lake of fire. And essentially he's saying there is going to be no more death after this happens. And Hades is going to cease to exist. In the Old Testament, Hades was referred to as Sheol. That's the Hebrew word. Sheol and Hades were the same thing, and simply the realm of the dead. It's the location. So death is a condition, and Hades or Sheol is the location. But after all this happens, it's going to be completely gone, because when people are in heaven, there's no more tears, there's no more death, there's no more suffering. And as if you're a true, genuine believer in Christ, no matter what you experience here on earth, it's something that you're going to be able to look forward to afterwards. Lastly, I want to go to Matthew chapter 24, because Jesus talks about this. This is going to be on page 20 of your pew Bible. It's after that second yellow tab. Matthew chapter 24, it's on page 20, if you want to go there. Matthew chapter 24, page 20, and I was going to start in verse 4, but I think I'm just going to read from the beginning and go all the way down to verse 25. And this is what's known as the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus and his disciples are on the Mount of Olives. Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." And as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen, and when will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And Jesus answered and said to them, "See to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, and saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of war. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pains. Then they will deliver you to tribulation, and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. The gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." This is, when he talks about the end will come, this is the end of the age of grace, meaning right before Jesus returns. "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on the Sabbath." Now before I go on, notice what he says here. Pray that it will not take place on the Sabbath. When is the Sabbath in biblical times? The Sabbath was on the 7th day of the week. Christians worship on the first day of the week. So this would not apply to Christians because the church does not go through the tribulation period. When the church is raptured, God's attention is going to be focused again on the nation of Israel. And Jews celebrate on the Sabbath. So this is more proof the church doesn't go through the tribulation. Verse 21. "For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those things had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, 'Behold, here is a Christ,' or 'There he is,' do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and will show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you in advance." So God gave us his word to tell us what's going to happen in the future. And the church, meaning people who are genuine believers in Christ, not just as Savior, but as Lord. And what that means is that we are not his servants, we are his slaves. And the difference between a servant and a servant does a job, a slave is owned. That's why Jesus is called master. And what happens is that we say, we no longer want to do our will, we want to do his. And that's what a true Christian is. A Christian is a slave. He's not just a servant, because a servant can quit. A slave, like I said, a slave is owned. So this is just the beginning of the tribulation period. In other words, we're just getting started. For the next Bible study, we're going to continue, or next couple Bible studies, we're going to continue talking about the remainder 3 seals that are going to be broke. And then we will eventually going to talk about who the 144,000 are. That's in chapter 7 of the book of Revelation. And then we'll get into the trumpet judgments, we'll get into the seal, or the bowl judgments, and then the return of Christ.